Over 400 people lost their lives in airplane accidents in 2025, making it the deadliest year for aviation since 2018. In just 1 week, multiple disasters unfolded across the world. A Boeing 787 crash in India, a Beechcraft air ambulance accident in Maine, and a Bolivian C-130 tragedy. Some of these incidents were unavoidable catastrophes, while others were the result of deadly mistakes that should never have happened. But will 2026 be any better? These are the 10 deadliest crashes. Their causes are worse than expected. Crash 10. 6 crew members aboard the Japan Coast Guard Dash 8 weren't thinking about the runway. They were thinking about the Noto Peninsula, where an earthquake had killed more than 200 people, and survivors were still waiting for supplies. The crew had already been delayed 40 minutes and were under pressure to move. When the tower instructed them to taxi to holding point Charlie 5, they moved past the hold short line and onto the active runway, believing they had been cleared to position for takeoff. On final approach, 367 passengers and 12 crew aboard Japan Airlines Flight 516 had no idea anyone was there. The approach was clean. Speed 145 knots, gear down, flaps set, nothing out of place. The aircraft was exactly where it was supposed to be. The problem was that another aircraft was also exactly where it was not supposed to be. Inside the control tower, the runway incursion warning system activated exactly as designed. Red alerts flashed. An aircraft was on the active runway. The warning held for nearly a full minute. Controllers saw it and dismissed it. Years of false alerts had trained them to treat the system as background noise. At 50 feet above the pavement, the Airbus crew saw the Dash 8 for the first time. There was no option left. Captain Sato pulled up, but the aircraft was already committed. The left main landing gear tore through the Coast Guard aircraft. Fuel ignited. The Dash 8 was destroyed in seconds. 5 of its 6 crew members died instantly. The surviving captain was thrown clear with severe burns. The Airbus slid nearly a kilometer down the runway, trailing flames, veering into the grass apron. Crew commands were immediate and precise. 379 people were evacuated in 18 minutes. Seconds after the last passenger cleared the door, the wide body was fully engulfed. It was the first hull loss of an Airbus A350 since the type entered service in 2015. Investigators confirmed a simple and lethal sequence: a misunderstood taxi clearance, a warning system dismissed through familiarity, controllers managing too many tasks at once, and language permissive enough to allow a fatal misinterpretation. Haneda was a failure of attention, of language, of systems trained to be ignored. The next crash, 8 months later, wasn't a failure of anything inside an aircraft. It was the result of something fired at it from the ground. Crash 9. The coordinates on the navigation display started jumping, snapping to positions that made no sense, then correcting, then jumping again. The crew of Flight 8243, an hour out of Baku on a short Christmas morning hop to Grozny, suspected a technical fault and requested radar vectors. What was actually happening was far more deliberate. Russian military electronic warfare units were jamming GPS signals across the entire region, feeding false positions to everything in the sky, civilian and military alike. 67 people on board had no way of knowing that the system they depended on was being actively manipulated. 2 attempts at Grozny failed in thick fog, and as fuel ran low, the crew turned back toward Baku. Clearance was granted, but the relief lasted only 60 seconds. A surface-to-air missile fired by Russian air defenses responding to a Ukrainian drone incursion detonated close to the aircraft's tail section. Hundreds of fragments tore through the fuselage at hypersonic velocity, severing hydraulic lines. A flight attendant in the rear galley was hit, along with passengers in the last 6 rows. The crew could not see the damage, but they felt it. Controls stiffened, and the rudder became sluggish. The aircraft yawed unpredictably with every input. Passengers pressed clothing against shrapnel wounds, while flight attendants moved through the cabin, trying to keep people conscious and seated. One survivor described the plane as moving like it was drunk. Russian airspace was closed to them. Baku was now 300 miles behind them across contested territory. The only viable option was east, across the Caspian Sea, toward Aktau, Kazakhstan, flying a structurally compromised aircraft with degrading controls and injured people bleeding in the cabin. They flew 300 miles like that until GPS stabilized over Kazakhstan and Aktau cleared their approach. Finally, what remained of the control authority gave out entirely. The Embraer stalled and struck the ground inverted, 3 kilometers short of the runway. 38 people died. 29 survived, most pulled from the tail section, which had separated on impact and come to rest upside down away from the main fuselage. Russia initially denied involvement, but Azerbaijan's president stated publicly within days that the aircraft had been shot down from Russian territory. Months later, Putin acknowledged it and offered condolences. The parallels to MH17 were immediate. A second civilian airliner brought down by a Russian surface-to-air missile in the same region by the same military. Russia eventually admitted what its missiles had done, but admissions do not bring back the dead. While world leaders debated accountability over the Caspian in Alaska, a pilot was already arguing with his own management about a different kind of preventable death. Crash 8. Chad Antil had flown Alaska's backcountry routes long enough to know when conditions were bad. On February 6th, they were worse than bad. The Cessna Grand Caravan lifted off from Unalakleet at 2:40 in the afternoon with 9 passengers aboard, heading 110 miles across Norton Sound to Nome. The sky looked passable, but the weight and balance sheet told a deadly story. The aircraft was carrying more than 1,000 pounds over its certified maximum for icy conditions. That number was not a technicality. Under active icing, every extra pound compresses the margin between controlled flight and stall, and the Caravan was already operating in conditions where that margin was shrinking by the minute. The de-icing boots pulsed on schedule, cracking ice from the leading edges. Under normal weight, they would have kept the wings clean, but that day, they could not keep up. Ice accumulated faster than the boots could shed it, adding drag, reducing lift, and quietly narrowing the speed band in which the aircraft could safely fly. At 6,000 feet, the temperature sat at -2 Celsius. Nome Tower called a 30-minute hold for runway de-icing, and Antil slowed to circle and wait. That was the moment the margins ran out. Airspeed dropped, the stall margin collapsed and the stick shaker fired, followed by the stall horn. Antil fought the controls, but the Caravan had no lift left to give. At 3:28, he made the only decision left: put the aircraft down on frozen Norton Sound. Without gear, at 70 knots, nose low, left bank, the ice hit the fuselage and tore the wings off. The engines separated on contact and fire spread across the frozen sea in seconds. All 10 people on board were dead before the wreckage stopped moving. The NTSB investigation revealed that Bering Air had flown the same Caravan overweight on multiple occasions in the days before the crash. Antil had raised the issue with management directly more than once. His fiancée told investigators that he said the company pressured crews to carry more cargo than the fuel and weight limits allowed. Management had documentation of his concerns, yet nobody acted on them. A pilot who warned management and was ignored, a crew that never had a chance. 9 months later, another aircraft was pushed past its limits. This time, the failure did not come from ice or overloaded cargo. It came from inside the metal itself, in a place no inspector had ever thought to look. Crash 7. The MD-11 freighter had been flying since 1991, 34 years of takeoffs and landings, each one flexing metal, compressing bearings, and cycling stress through the airframe in ways no visual inspection could see. On November 4th, It rolled onto runway 17, right at Louisville International, carrying 47,000 pounds of cargo bound for Honolulu, with 3 crew aboard and engines at full thrust. Every system was nominal from every angle being monitored. At 165 knots, Captain Richard Wartenberg lifted the nose and the main gear left the ground. For 22 seconds, the flight was routine. Then the left engine pylon aft mount fractured completely, the structure that had been holding 10,000 pounds of engine to the wing, cracking for years in a location no scheduled inspection examined. The GE CF6 engine, still producing 60,000 pounds of thrust, ripped from the wing and tumbled down the runway, trailing fire. Wartenberg had 3 seconds to decide with no good answer: abort onto the concrete and slide a burning freighter into the passenger terminal, or climb. He chose to climb. The MD-11 gained barely 100 feet before the left gear clipped a UPS warehouse and tore through a fuel line. The aircraft banked hard left and struck an industrial yard at 180 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact. A petroleum facility adjacent to the crash site exploded, feeding the fire that was already spreading from 38,000 gallons of jet fuel. All 3 crew members died instantly. 12 ground workers also died, and 23 more were burned, some critically, as the fire spread through the industrial complex before responders could contain it. The blaze burned for hours. The NTSB's preliminary findings identified catastrophic metal fatigue. Microscopic fractures had been propagating through the pylon aft mount across decades of flight cycles, invisible to visual inspection and outside the scope of any existing maintenance interval. The MD-11 had a documented history with pylon integrity. In 1992, a China Airlines MD-11 lost an engine on takeoff from Hong Kong under similar circumstances. Airworthiness directives followed, and inspection intervals were revised, yet none addressed the specific failure mode that killed Wartenberg's crew 33 years later. The aircraft was compliant with every current requirement on the morning it flew its last flight. It simply had more history in its metal than any checklist was designed to find. Some failures hide in the structure of the aircraft, while others hide in the very systems designed to protect it. Over Sao Paulo State, on a quiet Tuesday night, a plane that should have been grounded flew straight into a SIGMET warning, trusting instruments that had been lying for hours. Crash 6. Nothing on the flight deck suggested trouble as Voipass Flight 2283 went airborne. The ATR-72 held steady at 17,000 feet over Sao Paulo State, carrying 58 passengers and 4 crew on the short run from Cascavel to Guarulhos, with every display reading normal. But Brazil's Meteorological Service had issued a SIGMET warning about severe icing from 12 to 21,000 feet, and Flight 2283 was cruising dead through the middle of that band. The temperature was minus 10 degrees Celsius. Supercooled large droplets, water that stays liquid until it strikes metal, then freezes instantly, accreting faster than any system is designed to handle. The ice detector activated 6 times during the cruise. Each time, Captain Danilo Santos Romano engaged the de-icing boots, and each time the instruments confirmed the ice had cleared. Every readout indicated the aircraft was clean. What Romano did not know was that the de-icing system had been faulty since the previous evening. A pilot who flew the same aircraft the night before had noticed the fault and reported it verbally, but he never entered it in the technical log. Under regulations, a logged defect would have grounded the aircraft before it ever reached Cascavel. At 169 knots, well above the calculated stall speed, the stall warning erupted without warning. The stick shaker fired, and the left wing, heavily loaded with ice that the system had been reporting as absent, stalled first. Romano applied the opposite rudder and full power simultaneously. The combination rolled the aircraft through 90 degrees and stalled the right wing as well. With both wings gone, the ATR entered a flat spin, rotating and descending with no aerodynamic recovery available. The aircraft came down in a gated residential community in Vinhedo, 76 kilometers from its destination. All 62 people aboard died, including 6 oncologists traveling to a cancer conference and 2 children. 10 passengers who had booked seats on the same flight survived because they waited at the wrong gate and missed it entirely. The de-icing system had been reporting success on every activation, and the aircraft had been flying clean according to every instrument. Every lie the system told had been believed right up to the moment the wings stopped flying. In the next crash, the lies were even harder to explain because they did not come from ice or sensors. They came from switches inside the cockpit. Crash 5. Captain Sumit Sabharwal had 241 passengers behind him and a clean takeoff roll in front of him when the switches moved. The heavy fuel control levers on the Boeing 787 moved from run to cutoff on their own, 3 seconds after rotation, at 400 feet above Ahmedabad. Both Gen X engines lost fuel simultaneously. Sabharwal's voice on the cockpit voice recorder trembled. "Why did you cut off?" First Officer Clive Kunder answered immediately, "I didn't." Neither pilot had touched the switches. The ram air turbine was deployed, a small emergency propeller designed to preserve hydraulic power when engines are offline, but it could not restore fuel flow. Sabharwal attempted to restart Engine 1. It lit briefly, then flamed out. Engine 2 never responded at all. A 450,000-pound aircraft at 400 feet without thrust does not glide, it falls. 40 seconds after rotation, Flight 171 struck the BJ Medical College hostel at nearly 200 miles per hour. The building housed medical students, 19 of whom were killed in their rooms. Jet fuel ignited on contact, and fire consumed the impact site within seconds. All 241 passengers and 13 crew aboard were killed. One passenger, seated near the wing root, was thrown clear of the wreckage on impact and survived. 260 people did not. India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau confirmed that both fuel control switches moved to cutoff within a single second, exactly 3 seconds after wheels up. They were found in the on position when investigators reached the wreckage, indicating that someone or something had switched them back, either during the 40-second fall or at the moment of impact. 3 theories emerged: mechanical failure of the switch mechanism itself, an electrical fault causing uncommanded movement, or deliberate action by someone in the cockpit. Investigators pursued all 3 and could not eliminate any of them. The cockpit displays showed run the entire time. The engines had been cut while every instrument reported normal fuel flow. The switches moved, 260 people died, and to this day no aviation authority anywhere in the world has been able to say with certainty why. 260 people were dead, with no confirmed cause. In South Korea, 3 weeks earlier, there were no mysteries. Every failure was visible, documented, and recorded second by second, and it made no difference at all. Crash 4. Most of the 181 people on board were returning from Bangkok, relaxed, bags stowed, and ready to be home. Visibility was good and winds were calm. The approach was clean when the tower issued a bird warning. Pilots hear that phrase so often it barely registers, but this time it was already too late. A dense flock of Baikal teals crossed the glide path at landing speed, striking both CFM56 engines simultaneously. Compressor blades shattered, temperatures spiked in both cores, and thrust dropped on both sides at the same moment. The crew called for a go-around, the correct decision, but the engines responded weakly, and the aircraft could not climb. With stall margins collapsing and altitude gone, the crew committed to landing. In the chaos of simultaneous engine alerts, a critical input error occurred. The shutdown command meant for the damaged right engine was applied to the left instead, the engine still producing the most usable thrust. The left engine went silent 19 seconds after the bird strike, while the right, though hit harder, was still generating partial power. Both engines were now effectively failing, one from birds, one from a wrong switch. The landing gear was never confirmed down. The aircraft touched runway 1 on its belly at well above normal landing speed, metals scraping concrete and sparks trailing for thousands of feet. The crew had no brakes, no nose wheel, and no thrust reversers capable of arresting the speed. At the end of the pavement stood a concrete embankment housing the localizer antenna array for the instrument landing system. It had been built into the runway overrun area, was not frangible, and was not designed to brake on impact. The aircraft struck it at roughly 60 miles per hour, the nose section collapsing instantly. Fuel tanks ruptured, and fire filled the cabin within seconds. 179 people died. 2 flight attendants in the very rear survived when the tail detached and came to rest away from the fire. Post-crash simulations confirmed the belly landing itself had been survivable. The final 4 minutes of cockpit voice recorder data were unrecoverable, wiped when the CVR lost power at impact. The concrete embankment was not a required navigational installation and could have been frangible. South Korean authorities later arrested airport executives and opened criminal investigations into the airline and the Civil Aviation Authority. Every person on that aircraft could have walked away. Crash 3. 28 of them were figure skaters and coaches, returning from the U.S. Championships in Wichita, medals packed, flights booked, the season still ahead of them. They were 60 passengers and 4 crew on final approach to Reagan National, 278 feet above the Potomac. Runway straight ahead, checklist complete. From below, a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter climbed into the same space on a training mission from Fort Belvoir. The helicopter crew believed they were holding at 200 feet, the authorized altitude ceiling for that training route, but their altimeter was reading low by nearly 100 feet, placing them significantly higher than their instruments showed. At the same time, the Black Hawk's transponder had been switched off to simulate combat conditions. To the CRJ's TCAS collision avoidance system, the airspace ahead appeared empty, with no alerts, no warnings, and no evasive suggestions. The Black Hawk crossed the final approach path at 120 knots, its main rotor blades striking the CRJ's tail and shearing off the vertical stabilizer, horizontal stabilizer, and rudder in a single pass. The captain keyed the radio, "Reagan Tower, American 534, but the transmission ended mid-sentence. The aircraft rolled inverted and struck the Potomac at high speed, the fuselage breaking apart underwater. All 64 on board were killed. The helicopter crashed 400 feet away, and all 3 crew members also died. The House Oversight Committee's investigation, released in December 2025, found that the specific conflict zone between helicopter training routes and commercial approach paths at Reagan National had been flagged in safety reports as far back as 2022. Controllers had raised concerns, and the FAA had conducted reviews, but the routes were never separated. Recovery divers worked the near-freezing Potomac for days. Among the figure skaters identified were members of the U.S. junior national team, coaches who had spent decades in the sport, and a 9-year-old girl traveling with her mother. None of them had any reason to know that the airspace above the river had been flagged as dangerous, because no one in a position to fix it ever did. Washington's tragedy was caused by a system everyone knew was broken and nobody fixed. In Catmandu, the danger was also well known, but the difference was that this time, the people who certified the aircraft safe were sitting inside it when it fell. Crash 2. The Sauria Airlines CRJ-200 had been sealed on the ramp at Catmandu for 34 days when it was finally released back to service. On July 24th, it was cleared for a short repositioning flight to Pokhara. 19 people were on board, 2 pilots and 17 airline technicians, the same people who had inspected the aircraft and signed the paperwork declaring it ready to fly. Takeoff from runway 2 began normally, airspeed building through 60, 80, 100, 125 knots. Rotation was called, and the nose lifted. For a moment, everything seemed standard. Then the pitch rate climbed far past normal, the nose rising through 25 degrees, nearly twice the recommended attitude, while airspeed began to fall rather than climb. On a correctly loaded CRJ, that does not happen. The aircraft rolled right, then left, oscillating violently as the crew fought controls that were already out of balance. The technicians in the cabin were thrown from side to side with no time to understand what was happening and no procedure that applied to what the aircraft was doing. 33 seconds after liftoff, the right wing struck the taxiway edge lights and clipped a metal freight container at the runway boundary. The aircraft cartwheeled, inverted, and dropped into a 130-foot gorge beyond the perimeter, the fuselage breaking apart on impact as fuel ignited. 17 technicians and the first officer were killed. The captain was thrown clear and survived with severe burns. Of the 19 people aboard, he was the only one who walked out. The investigation committee found that the aircraft had been loaded using a speed card, a document listing the critical airspeeds for that day's takeoff weight and configuration, that contained incorrect values. The card had never been independently verified against the actual weight and balance data. The committee also found that Soria Airlines had recorded previous incidents of abnormally high pitch rates during takeoff on the same aircraft type. The airline had investigated them internally, but no corrective action had been taken, no additional crew guidance issued, and no technical examination of the loading process had been ordered. The crew on our number 1 crash had no paperwork problems, no overloaded aircraft, and no wrong switch. They were experienced, the aircraft was serviceable, and the approach was routine. Yet on short final, 1,300 meters short of the runway, every layer of redundancy failed at once. Crash 1. The night over Leipzig was quiet when the cargo doors closed on a Boeing 737-400 that had already lived a long working life. On November 25th, Swift Air Flight 2976 rolled out before dawn, carrying 12 tons of parcels bound for Vilnius. Captain Arūnas Valinskas had logged 18,000 hours, and First Officer Mindaugas Jankauskas had logged 9,400. 2 cargo specialists rode in the cabin. The route to Vilnius was familiar, and nothing felt rushed. Vilnius weather was manageable with broken cloud at 2,000 feet, 6 kilometers visibility, light rain, and air temperature just above freezing. It was a standard winter arrival in the Baltic. Small anomalies began appearing as the aircraft crossed into Lithuanian airspace. The autopilot dropped without warning and reconnected. Hydraulic pressure flickered. The left engine ran warm. Rudder trim crept and had to be corrected. Each fault alone was manageable, but together they pointed at something no one had yet named. 1 minute before impact, Valinskas declared an emergency. He did not itemize failures or request checklists, only stating that they needed to land immediately. Fire crews rolled, and controllers cleared the runway. The cockpit could not explain what was failing, only that the situation was deteriorating faster than it could be diagnosed. At 1,000 feet, the jet still appeared stable. At 500 feet, hydraulic system alpha failed outright, the left engine lost power, and rudder authority drained away, forcing extreme deflection just to hold heading. Airspeed bled as the crew hand-flew an aircraft, losing redundancy by the second. At 300 feet, Valinskas saw the trajectory. They were going to come up short, into the houses north of the airport. He pushed for full power. The right engine answered, but the left did not. Asymmetric thrust yawed the aircraft hard left and the rudder reached its travel limit. Nothing more was available. At 5:28 and 42 seconds, the freighter struck the ground 1.3 kilometers from the runway. The first officer was killed instantly, while the captain and 2 cargo specialists survived with critical injuries. Investigators traced the cascade to metal fatigue in the hydraulic lines, oil contamination in the left engine, and long-standing rudder anomalies that had never been resolved. Each failure was individually survivable, but combined on short final, they overwhelmed every layer of redundancy the aircraft had been designed to provide. Thanks for watching. Please click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.